Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, Community Engagement Update, Baltimore and BTU, a discussion around best practices, strategies, and responsiveness of nonprofits in Baltimore during COVID-19. Between Susan Malone, the Executive Director of Wide Angle Youth Media, and Matthew Durington, the Director of Community Engagement and Partnerships at Towson University. Before I hand it over to them, I wanted to share a few quick logistics for today's webinar. Please feel free to enter any questions or comments at any time throughout today's discussion in the Q&A section. I'll be sharing this with them at the end of their discussion. Additionally, the chat function is enabled, so if you'd like to share anything with all attendees, please feel free to enter it there. We will be recording today's session so we can share it afterwards, and you can share it with your colleagues if you think anyone would be interested. And all attendees are muted with your video off. Lastly, please bear with us. All of us are still figuring some of this out. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Matthew and Susan.
Awesome. Thank you, Kathleen, and welcome to everybody. We really appreciate you giving the time today as we discuss some of the strategies that nonprofits are taking during COVID-19, the pandemic. And we wanted to feature one of our exemplary community collaborators for Towson University, which is Wide Angle Youth Media. I want to go and introduce my colleague, Susan Malone. So Susan is the Executive Director of Wide Angle Youth Media. She attended some local art school in Baltimore. I've heard of it. I think it's Micah or something like that. No, Micah, right. But has had a distinguished career, has been with Wide Angle since 2003 and has really brought it into national prominence and has a large set of expertise in terms of nonprofit management, communication strategies, and what have you, which is why we really wanted to have this conversation so she could share what Wide Angle's been doing as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic. I also want to share some of my colleagues on the board for Wide Angle Youth Media, of which David Bogan, Kevin Abinet, and myself right there, and just to show the team that supports Susan as well as her staff and a number of the other individuals that are really part of the Wide Angle team that Susan will talk about. So I'm going to go ahead and share a PowerPoint and let Susan talk to some of the things that Wide Angle's been doing. So Susan, if you can you just tell us what Wide Angle, for those who don't know the organization, what Wide Angle is and what the organization does?
Yeah, thank you, Matt, so much for having me here today. It's a great pleasure to be with everyone in the Towson community. So Wide Angle is a media education organization, and so we really are focused on cultivating and amplifying the voices of young people in Baltimore and engaging audiences across generational, cultural, and social divides. And a lot of people ask me, what is youth media? Because there's this idea that it's really focused on the technical media making skills, which is kind of one bucket of the work. But we're also really thinking about critical thinking skills, media literacy. So what you're consuming, how you're consuming it, and what the messages are that we have around us in the media world. Thinking about how you create something, you also have to know how to speak about it. So the idea of public speaking skills comes into play. There's a lot around social justice. And then the last component is really youth development skills. So really focusing on making sure that we're building a young person and providing them with the supports they need. Overall, as an organization, we are almost on our 20th year. We've engaged over 5,800 young people and exposed the work to over 2 million audience members. And as you think about what young people are making, it's really important that their stories aren't made in a vacuum, that they're really being disseminated to a large group of people to have the greatest impact. And our end game is really empowering young people to navigate college, career, and life. And so if you're building up the skills so that they can be strong communicators and effective storytellers, you want to make sure that they're moving into the field in a really effective way. So we do this in a variety of ways. And so if you look at our programming pathways, we really start with small engagements. So community-based programs in schools and community where young people have access to opportunity to create media to see if this is an engaging art form for them. And then as they transition into our pathway for education, we start at age 10 and go through age 24. Our middle school programs are in partnership with the Enoch Pratt Free Library. We've been partnering with them since 2001, really looking at small ways to engage young people in creating content, building community service, and talking about issues in their community where they live and work and go to school. In high school, as they transition into our longer form programming during the academic year, students can create a variety of media and design, social media, photography, and video, and they're really focused again on critical issues. But in middle school, you're thinking about like kind of my story and how does what I'm experiencing in the world happen. And then as you move into high school, you start telling the city story. So it's our story, this kind of more systemic injustice stories about things they want to see change in all of Baltimore. And then as you move into our apprenticeship pathway, we have young people really looking at how they're kind of moving through and into college and career. And so they can participate in training as well as on the job skill building to move into the communications arena. And we have a social enterprise that does production for hire as well as design for hire, where these apprentices work with our professional staff to tell stories of clients. And the last component is really looking at summer. In the past, it was always around like this idea of summer camp, and that's really not an effective way for young people to have meaningful engagements in the summer. So we do a paid program where young people are employed through YouthWorks in the summer, and they're really giving back to community and finding ways to kind of expand. And we'll talk a little bit more about this at the end of the webinar about opportunities for us to help support organizations in Baltimore. So the last piece is really thinking about impact of the work. And so if you start at the individual level, you're really thinking about those skill developments, right? We're mentoring young people. We're making sure that they have a safe space to go after school and in the summer. And we're looking at college and career preparation. Then we want to make sure that there's a ripple effect into community, thinking about how we leverage resources, how we're building partnerships in Baltimore and beyond, and how we're engaging in civic conversations. And then if you look at the systemic change, we're looking at how we're really shifting social issues, how we're countering challenges to career and life, and then we're also looking at audience engagement. So I talked a little bit about our social enterprise. This is a really important part of the organizations, and a lot of nonprofit organizations are shifting into this model of having a fee-for-service stream of revenue for the organization. So we started in 2012 when we got 1,000 phone calls like saying, hey, can you make this thing for us? And we were like, no, we don't do that. We do media education for kids. And we would hang up the phone. And one day we were like, wait, we've said no a lot. Why are we saying no? And so we spent a year playing with the idea and saying yes. And we started realizing that if you're really trying to build real world skills, that young people can really create high quality content. So that last component of apprenticeship is really, how are you learning to tell the stories of others? And so our production company now brings in around $1 million of revenue for the organization a year. We have over 30 clients that range from Under Armour to Kaiser Permanente to nonprofit organizations like Outward Bound to really small organizations that are creating really wonderful stories in Baltimore. And we have been doing that for a little while, and it's really a rewarding part of the work is building those life skills for our students. So there's lots of ways to become involved in the organization, from being a guest artist to consuming some of our amazing media to sharing our social media posts. We're also looking to expand our media partnerships where we place our apprentices over the summer. And then obviously there's volunteer opportunities as well.
So we'll post that last slide up at the end so everyone can make sure and get all the social media platforms for Wide Angle, and the communication strategies and the sharing of different media and what youth are producing has been one of the most exciting things that has been part of the Wide Angle portfolio. So one of those things that, and we'd be remiss not to mention this, is that we're looking right at the 5-year anniversary of the Baltimore Uprising and Freddie Gray. And one of the great projects that Wide Angle produced at that time was This is Baltimore. And I was wondering, Susan, if you could talk a little bit about this as just one form of the different media that's created out of Wide Angle.
Sure. So, I mean, I think it's really important to note that last year was the 5-year anniversary of the uprising. And right when that happened for Wide Angle, we embarked on a year-long exploration with our students that culminated in the publication of this book, This is Baltimore, as well as a series of stories of a variety of different issues that impacted our students at that time. And so while what happened during the uprising is if you have 85,000 young people in Baltimore City schools, about 200 young people were involved in this moment in time. And so our students as a whole were having this need to share back with the greater community that there's so many positive things that young people are doing, but there's also so much systemic inequity in Baltimore. And they wanted to kind of uplift some of those injustices in our social system. And it kind of ties really quickly to what's happening right now with COVID-19, which requires us to examine our shortcomings as medical reports highlight the pandemic's disproportionate impact on communities of color and residents with differing abilities, right? And so 5 years ago, our students shared these stories about inadequate public transit, talking about education disparities, healthcare access, food access, insecure housing, and we're seeing all of these things tie right back again 5 years later. Like it's almost as if there was no change in the landscape in our community. And right now we have a magnifying glass on this. And so 5 years ago, it was really about creating a volume and conversations of work that could happen over time. And right now, our students are reacting in a much different way. It's about an immediacy. It's about this immediate moment, and we're calling it kind of like moments from the field, because we really want to share a platform for our students to highlight these emotional experiences that they're having right now. It's not about sharing it in this curated volume like we did with This is Baltimore, which was really important at the time because it was a dialogue that needed to happen and needs to continue happening. Right now, our students' stories need to be reflected daily.
And I think that's been one of the most amazing things to see in the last few weeks are all the different stories and other things that are coming out and are not. It's the same with This is Baltimore. The national media was covering Baltimore and what was happening in a particular way, but the youth producers in Wide Angle were able to show a different perspective, a different take on Baltimore, what was happening from that ground up. And the same thing's happening right now with all the different forms of media and sharing that are taking place with some of the COVID-19 responses. So why don't we look at some of those different things that the organization's been producing. So this is just a web archive of the weekly digest that is sent out by Wide Angle. Could you speak a little bit about just the different forms of communication and that you're trying to impart to the larger Baltimore community?
Yeah, I think, we're trying to draw on those personal experiences and how creating media right now is talking about the brighter future we want to have. We really want to highlight the fact that young people are often the most underheard voice in the United States. And often, if we look at Baltimore City schools, I think there was a statistic, something that I like to think about, is students in general are asked less than once a month their opinion on something, right? And so if we don't elevate youth voice and don't value youth voice, then how are we really going to perpetuate change, not just in Baltimore, but nationwide? And so we see this as a time to listen, and we really want the people in our community to kind of read Quarantine Weekly and to check out our Instagram challenges and to say hey, what are we thinking as young people and how is this experience similar or different than my own, so that we can reflect and have opportunities to hear voices, not just our students' voices, but also the voices of our audience members.
And the Instagram channel for Wide Angle is a really, really fun space where these Instagram challenges have been happening from a lot of the youth producers. Could you speak a little bit about what are some of these challenges and these are the students that are coming up with these, correct?
Yeah, sometimes they're students and sometimes they're staff. I think we wanted to really focus on being creative and responsive. And so you can't just do business as usual, right? I can't expect that students are going to show up for an 8-week program for 4 hours a week. And so we wanted opportunities to engage our staff and our students in a very different way. And so sometimes our staff create challenges around a moment, like the pink moon and the day that happened, and it reminded me to go outside and check out the sky. And sometimes it's about our alumni sharing the stories of what it feels like to be unemployed again, or what does it feel like to have career insecurity. We have some students who are saying, we have a rite of passage and we need to have a virtual prom and we need to talk about the experience of COVID in a community of people that we care about. So it's not just about, saying everything is a challenge. It's also about highlighting the joys, right? And so I think what's beautiful about the Instagram challenges is that we're really looking to find new ways to do programming and engage young people and make sure that they're safe and they feel connected to their mentors. but we also want to provide a space to share the authentic experience. And I can't say what that is as a white woman, right? I need to make sure that we have a platform for all voices, all diverse voices, to kind of have a place to share their stories. And that's really important to us as an organization.
And this, and with all the different, stories that are out there, a lot of them are sad and they're tragic, and people are struggling. They're having anxiety and they're having stress. But we also want to give a platform for youth to be youth. And one of the most exciting things I've seen come out of Wide Angle Youth Media is this idea of the virtual prom. Because it really is showing the joy that students are bringing to it as they're making TikTok videos and getting ready for this virtual prom. So can you tell me how that came around as a strategy?
Yeah, I would never have guessed that this would have been a thing for us, but we're trying to figure out ways to engage our core students as well as other young people across the country. And so the prom kind of came out of this idea that if you don't know, the prom in Baltimore is like a really big deal. I mean, I'm talking like photo shoots and like planning and big cakes. And so we had all these young people starting to talk with us about their dresses and what they were going to wear and what the day was going to be like. And it's more than this rite of passage, right? It's this moment in time that celebrates the culmination of high school. And so for us as an organization, we started seeing ways that we could make this virtual prom happen for our young people. And so having that rite of passage and that experience to re-envision a better future for themselves and to also have a moment of joy, right? I think we've lost a lot of joy and celebration and we're zoomed out. And so maybe this is a way that we can just have a lot of fun and dress up.
Absolutely. No, and I highly encourage folks to check out the TikTok videos and other things that people are making are just so much fun to watch. And just, along with all the other communication streams, whether it's on Instagram, Facebook, on Twitter, you've been sharing it, and it's not redundant, but it's showing on different platforms the different strategies that you're undertaking to communicate to your constituency, to your donorship, and what have you as well, but also providing a number of different COVID-19 resources for the students as well.
Yeah, I think part of it was right when this started happening as an organization, we realized we needed some grounding values for how we were going to operate in this space. And we came up with 4 areas, and most of what we've highlighted so far is our responsive action, right? Being an anchor for community engagement and finding ways to engage not just our students, but our audience members. And so the challenges is kind of falling into that bucket and using storytelling to make sure we're sharing those authentic experiences. But the other 2 areas of value for the organization is really around clarity and resilience. And so the first is letting our staff members and students be adaptive and creative and take risks, and rethinking how we remain connected to one another when we're so much isolated. And the other part is around resilience. And so thinking about being flexible and connected and consistent and grateful. And so we realized our young people, there's so much information coming at us so quickly that we have to really curate a list of resources for our families and our students. But then there's other organizations that are doing that for like the nonprofit sector, or for medical, or for social emotional learning. But for us as an organization, we wanted to focus a list on things that we knew our students and families would really need access to.
Yeah, it's great. It's a great resource page, and there's definitely been some organizations that have been able to almost aggregate a bunch of different resources. I've referred to as a fire hose. It's like a fire hose of information that's coming at people, and to have a trusted source that you can go to say, okay, these are curated. I trust this organization. I know what they're trying to do. That's a really important thing at this point as well. So I highly encourage folks to check out the Wide Angle website, which is wideangleym.org. And I'll put the links to what we just showed on the Chrome on the chat as we're doing Q&A, just so people can link directly to them if they like. But I'd like to maybe pivot a little bit, because one of the other, we just didn't want to highlight what Wide Angle was doing, but you've also been involved in the nonprofit sector in Baltimore for going on 20 years now. And we're seeing some issues. Some organizations are responding well. Some organizations are looking at 1 month of funds. Some of them are wondering whether they're going to exist in the next few months. So I was wondering if you could maybe just speak a bit about how you think the nonprofit sphere is responding, maybe not so much nationally, but in our region in Baltimore.
Yeah, I mean, I think to start with that question, Matt, I'd like to frame a little bit about the nonprofit industry overall.
Sure.
And so in Maryland, we have 35,000 nonprofit organizations, and 13% of our workforce is generating about $54.6 billion in annual revenue for the state. And there's about 1.5 million nonprofit organizations in the country, and they bring in about 5.3% of the gross domestic product. And so if typically people think about the largest nonprofit organizations like the United Way or the Salvation Army, but if you look at Maryland in general, the 35,000 that are here, 50% of them have a budget of less than 25,000. So if you talk about like trying to figure out, financial runways and stability, it is a very scary sector right now. And so a little more framing is 1 in 10 people in the United States work for the nonprofit industry. And so that's also for me, when I'm hearing about all these small business loans and all these things our government is doing, they're really not addressing that there's this huge sector, the nonprofit sector, that is doing so much work across the country. And so in Maryland, I think there's a few things to note that 30% of the nonprofit organizations have less than 1 month of cash flow. And so if we're talking about how are we going to be sustainable long term, we really need to talk about sustainable partnerships with one another and really leaning on each other to think about where we need supports. And sometimes it is cash flow, and sometimes it is thinking about accounts receivable and how you're going to manage resources over time. But more often than not, it's about how are we going to double down and make sure that we're supporting our workforce, right? And so for Wide Angle, my commitment was how are we going to make sure that we're keeping all 35 employees on the job and doing meaningful work at this time? And how are we going to support other nonprofit organizations when they need it?
And I think you hit on something that's really, really important, because the nonprofit sector is a workforce development sector. And a lot of the students that are coming out of higher ed, some of their first jobs are with nonprofits, whether they volunteered or interned with those nonprofits while they were in college. And maybe that's their first job. Maybe it's a job that continues on, that they stay with that organization. So as we're thinking about how to support our community partners and nonprofits going forward, these are some of the things that we're going to have to really think about is what are models of sustainability? Is there the possibility that there's resource sharing? Does there need to be an accountant and a grant writer for every single different nonprofit? But are there ways to start amalgamating and bringing these things together? And I think a lot of the things we're going to need to be thinking about going forward as we're developing our nonprofit skill set and the way we want to support our partners too, is what can we do to maybe even regenerate some nonprofits? And if they have to go dormant for a couple of months, but then that 501c3 or that Form 990 still needs to be produced. So these are some of the things that we're thinking about from the Towson University side about what we can do. And we're always looking to community partners to talk back to us, to open up that voice so that we know what we can do in terms of being responsive.
I think it's really refreshing to hear how a university is going to support the industry as a whole. And if we're looking at Baltimore City and across the country, 1 in 10 are working for nonprofits. In Baltimore City, it's 1 in 4. And so if we're really looking at the sector and how we're going to support the workforce and the partnerships, we have to think differently. And so, accounting services, grant services, definitely it's a staffing issue, but then there's also just mentorship and advice, support with evaluation. There's lots of things that universities can do to kind of elevate the profile of their partnerships so that we can draw more attention to the industry and more support for the people that we're supporting.
And I think too, one of the things to think about is there's automatic, roles or pools of specialized knowledge that people may be thinking about. If you're an accountant professor, guess what? You can help out with accounting, but there's pools of specialized knowledge all over the place, and being able to open those up. And if folks are thinking about, okay, what can I do in my role, in my academic specialization, or in my discipline, there is a way to do community engagement, and there is a way to think about supporting nonprofits. I know that you've had a lot of interaction with Towson University faculty beyond myself in a variety of different ways over time.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much opportunities, and then there's also the student population, right? And so, as an organization, we're building those pathways into college and career. So our students really need to experience and understand what it's like to be on campus. And one of my most favorite moments working with Towson is our students went in and presented to your classroom of anthropology students, right? And they taught media skills to anthropology students, and then those students taught our our students about, what it's like to be on a college campus and what is it like to learn in the classroom. And so all of a sudden you're level the playing field where, everyone is an expert and everyone has skills to share and opportunities to learn, and that we're really here to build lifelong learners. And so that's what we need to do as an organization. But I think everyone often is sharing sugar in very different ways, to quote John Brothers from the T. Rowe Price Foundation. We need to figure out new models of how nonprofits can function together and advocate together. And you're seeing right now a lot of organizations come together to talk about digital equity and access for young people in Baltimore City, because it is a very unfair moment in education where some people have access to technology and some don't. So you'll see a lot of nonprofit organizations right now coming together to advocate for food or for the homeless. Yesterday, there was a car protest to talk about the fact that Baltimore needs to do more for the community to protect the most vulnerable populations. So I think we can advocate a lot as an industry as well.
Yeah. Well, towards that end, are there any particular items of advice that you would offer some of our collaborators and partners out in the nonprofit or community engagement sector right now?
I always hesitate to say advice, but I will share some things that I think is really important for us as an organization and something that I think is important for the nonprofit sector. If you are a steward of public resources, for me, I think it's most important to build trust and remain transparent. And so whether that's with my board or the staff or our donors or the community that we have at large, it's about talking about your financial runway and being really transparent with where your numbers are and where you need help and where you need support. I think it's really important to build community with your team and your staff. And so right now people are feeling very much burnt out and stressed personally and through work. And so being very quiet and listening to what their needs are and seeing how you can be responsive. There's a lot of policies being thrown out and they're really hard to navigate. And so really leaning on advisors on the board and in your community, whether it's a university partnership, but to navigate some of those policies to make sure you're reflecting what is required of you. And then thinking a lot about being authentic in this work and centering yourself as a community resource. What can you do? What can you provide? And do not overcommit.
Oh, that's something that we talk about all the time. Do not promise the moon and the stars. Only think about what you can do in your capacity, because even in that capacity, it's going to be helpful. But over promising, this is not the time. It's never the time to do it, but this is definitely not the time to do that either. So I think we're going to go ahead and open up for Q&A. But as the questions are being brought up in the window, Kathleen's going to handle that. But while those questions are queuing up, I want to share one more resource that Susan mentioned earlier, and that is a RFP of sorts for this summer. So this is the Media Works. If you want to go and talk a bit about this, Susan.
Sure.
This is a really exciting opportunity for a lot of folks out there.
Thanks, Matt. So as an organization, our summer employment program is called Media Works. This summer, we might employ about half as many just because YouthWorks is still looking at what their opportunities for the summer for payment's going to be. But our young people really wanted to give back and have an opportunity to really build client-based work. And so last year, we had the privilege of working with Black Women Build and helping them tell the stories about why it's so important to kind of build community and homes in Baltimore. And so our students create video, design, photography for nonprofit organizations. Our RFP is out. We're going to pick a couple organizations to really help them with their social media strategies, their design materials. And so it kind of centers youth voice at the front of it and really provides high quality products for nonprofit organizations that might not be able to afford the opportunity to hire us.
Great. Now, I know that's something that, a lot of organizations right now are wondering what's going to happen with YouthWorks. I think a lot of us are frustrated because a lot of community engagement opportunities and strategies and best practices were really hitting their stride in the last couple of years and even in the last several months. And this was going to be a huge summer for YouthWorks. It's grown every single year, and then to kind of hit this wall, but also realizing how many families and youth have relied on YouthWorks, That's something that they really expect every single summer, because it keeps people employed. And if you're keeping people employed and you're giving them things to do, guess what? That's going to work against some of the other socioeconomic issues and outcomes that we know are, unfortunately part of the Baltimore landscape. So I don't know if we have any questions. Yeah, let me bring up the window.
None yet, Matt.
Okay, that's fine. Well, maybe I can ask a question then. Not to challenge you too much, Susan, but let's project a bit and think about where we're going to be a year from now. And this is, I would hope behind us, but probably still grappling with in some degree. How do you think this is going to impact our students? And this is something that's heartbreaking, I think, to all of us. We're watching our seniors, both in K through 12, but also our seniors, at Towson University, who were about to go out into the workforce or about to, get into that next stage of adulthood. And I'm just wondering, what are we going to need to do, and what are we going to need to think about trying to get this generation that's really, Generation C now in some respects, ready going forward?
Wow. I think everything looks different, right?
Yeah.
I don't think this is unlike the uprising where everybody could kind of eventually go back to work and go back to life as we knew it. We really have to think about education different. Kids are learning differently. We're reconnecting to nature and our bodies in a different way, and putting health at the front of our conversations. And we also have to look at work is different, right? People aren't going to want to go back to an 8-hour workday where we're sitting in front of our computers and not able to move around. And so I think what we've tried to do as a nonprofit organization is really think in 90-day windows. And so I think trying to think a year, 2 years out right now is really unrealistic. I was talking with a variety of executive directors from across the country, and it's really about, how do you manage your cash flow right now? How are you managing budgets to think creatively and give opportunity to pivot and be as creative as possible with the kinds of programs and connectivity you have? We really want to underlie the importance of relationships right now. And so relationship between mentor and student, relationships to alumni, and making sure that we're listening to support them and help them navigate those pathways. And then, I really hope we get to go back into the classroom, because I have beautiful media labs that we just built out and want to put into work. But we also were able to get laptops in the hands of a lot of our older youth so they could, one, do their college and high school work, but also be able to create content and be media makers. So while I think the landscape for work and education looks different, I think this is an opportunity for us as educators and as employers to be able to rethink what those experiences are like in a new way.
No, and I've tried to encourage, folks that, I work with at Towson University. It may sound trite, but, even journaling during all this is, because what's happening is we're all generating ideas because we're trying to be nimble and we're triaging what's going on. But these may end up becoming strategies like what you just articulated. A 90-day window is probably much more effective than worrying about something that's going to be a year down the road. See what you can do when you can do it, and that feels more feasible, then that breeds more confidence. Toward that end too, we do have a question from Kiona Gorham. How is Wide Angle supporting the mental and emotional well-being of their youth as they actively engage in these hard yet necessary conversations? It's a great question.
Social emotional learning is really at the forefront of youth development programs. So I appreciate that question. First thing we needed to do was make sure that we were maintaining relationships with our young people. And so we are doing weekly personal calls with them because it doesn't rely on equity access. We're also, we created an emergency fund. We've had this thanks to an amazing donor. We started off with a $2,000 emergency fund, and we transitioned over $5,500 worth of resources into it to support our students, whether they're dealing with housing or food insecurities, or digital equity access issues. So being able to make sure kids have computers, access to Creative Suite, access to food, and then that resource list. But during those calls, things come up, right? Things have been really hard for our students. They're wrestling with unhealthy relationships at home. They're having a lack of privacy, disconnected from their friends. None of this is new information. I'm just kind of highlighting some of the things that we're hearing. We've had students be hospitalized. We have students that need medication. And so for us, I think as providers, we need to think about where we are experts and where we are not. I am not a social worker. I am not a doctor. So we want to make sure that we are referring and giving our students as many resources as possible, that we understand the kind of triggers that young people are experiencing so that we can get them the support they need. And at the same time, if they need financial support, that we're there for them as an organization, giving them the resource access or the funds that they need. And then lastly, vicarious trauma in this field is massive. And I think that's another area that our university partners can support is how can we really make sure our staff, when they're hearing things, are also taking care of their own well-being, because vicarious trauma is a real thing.
Absolutely, and that's been one of the really nice developments that have come the last few weeks too. Our organizations and institutions, developing these emergency funds at Towson University. There's the annual giving campaign has been re-engineered towards supporting students and an emergency fund, but also faculty and staff too. And I think that's such an important point that even if you're in a space where you're helping people and you're looking to serve populations, you have to think about your own mental health and well-being too.
And I also have been kind of amazed at how many alumni are giving back. We have a student whose family is like running a food pantry out of their church. And every day they're just like rolling up their sleeves and getting out food to the community. We have students who are participating in protests, some that are documenting, some that are editing Zoom education webinars together for clients. But however people are giving back, we have board members who are building face shields and starting new businesses and cleaning buildings. And I think it's really important that we just share those stories of how people are engaging. Because if you go back to the sector, I just want to highlight that there's 77 billion hours of volunteer work in this country with 63 million volunteers. And now is the time that people can volunteer more than ever to make sure that they're finding ways to give back.
I think that's a great note to end on, because I don't think we do have any other questions, but that there are still volunteer opportunities. There's virtual volunteering. There's a lot of different organizations. And even if you are in your home, there are things you can do. And if you are able to do so to help financially support different organizations as well, a little goes a long way at this time, especially when we're talking about developing emergency funds and other things as well. But I don't want to necessarily end on a bad note, or not a bad note, maybe just a realistic note. But can you maybe just share one quick anecdotal story or whatever that's come out of the Wide Angle Youth producers, just something that crossed your desk in the last couple of weeks that really just showed you the ingenuity and innovation of the Wide Angle Youth producers and the staff?
I mean, every day I'm blown away by the amazing team I get to work with. I think, it surprises me time after time that media is a time capsule, right? And if you can look back at media that's made 5 years ago and made yesterday, there's so many parallels that it's about critically examining social issues. And so we just published a story by a young person highlighting his aunt's experience in the medical world and how it was definitely around racial injustice. And so if we look at those underlying inequalities that must be addressed, I think we as a society can really come together to figure out new ways to fight some of these problems together so that we can build a just society.
I agree. And I want to encourage everyone to go to wideangleym.org, where all these different stories are collected. That's been a highlight for me every week, if not every day. I'm wired into all the wide angle social media platforms, but just finding those refuge spaces where this is a great story from a young person in Baltimore just relating to what's going on with them, or sharing an important story, or sharing a moment of joy, or maybe just sharing something funny. And it's okay to have those moments of levity in a time of pronounced tragedy as well. So Susan, I just want to say thank you on behalf of Towson University and the Division of Strategic Partnerships and Applied Research and the BTU team. We really value our collaboration with you and the Wide Angle staff and youth producers. And thank you so much for offering all this advice and these strategies. And I want to encourage folks, if you really do want to look at some great modeling and some great strategies and practices for how to connect to your constituency and how to provide resources and other things, please go ahead and check out Wide Angle Youth Media, and stay tuned. We'll be offering some more webinars in the coming weeks talking about best practices and strategies for community engagement and partnerships. And thanks for attending.
Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you.